Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast with me, Rory Lees-Oakes. And with me is my fellow traveller on the information superhighway, Mr. Ken Kelly. How are you, Ken?
Oh, I am so good today, Rory. Thank you very much for asking. A little bit of sun here in Warrington, which brightens everything up. I've even had to close one of the curtains so it doesn't shine on the screen and I can see you. It's interesting you mentioned information superhighway because that kind of keys in to what we're going to be covering today in an action-packed episode, this episode 28. We're going to be kicking off speaking about the information highway itself, speaking about where counselling is going. They say the future of counselling, but I guess it's the now of counselling when we look at e-counselling or online counselling. And then something really interesting for me is Theory with Rory today. It's an area of which I know little about, I will say for you, Rory, and that is cognitive dissonance. You're going to be giving us a flavour of that.
I am, and this is an academic podcast. So if you're listening to this for the first time, just kind of bear with us because this is a theory born of an interesting book called When Prophecy Fails, and it's a story, and it's you'll find it in any psychology book, of aliens and end of the world, and the psychologist who studied end of the world cults and came up with this really interesting theory called cognitive. And what's equally interesting about the work of Leon Festinger is that he was part of this organisation. He infiltrated it and saw firsthand how people's thinking could be altered. And it links in very strongly to clients who are sometimes a little hard to help because they may be in an abusive relationship and they may be convincing themselves that at some level not to change and not to move away from it. So cognitive dissonance, but it does feature aliens and it does feature an end of the world. So it is an interesting archetype of history, Ken.
Lots to look forward to there. I look forward to learning about that, kind of the Area 51 of counselling and psychotherapy there, Rory. And then we're going to be ending today's episode looking at appropriate referrals, a really important part and something, yes, we study in our training, but when you're there on that front line and you get into a situation where you need to make an appropriate referral, it's always good to refresh and think of what the options are and what is the respectful way to kind of cradle and look after our clients while we do that. But without any further ado, onto that superhighway, the information superhighway, looking at the future of counselling that is in the here and now, using technology to counsel. And of course, we have e-counselling, online counselling, counselling via video conferencing, counselling via email, counselling via Skype. And I guess it's not really that new in that there has been telephone counselling, but quite a bit that we have to consider when we look to e-counselling.
Yes, and I know, Ken, you speak with some expertise on this because you've got a qualification in online counselling. But it's really, really interesting how counselling's evolved. And I was speaking about 18 months ago to Dr. Kate Anthony, who's an authority in the UK on online counselling, and I was absolutely surprised to find when we had the interview, we might have the interview in the archives somewhere, Ken, that she was doing tests as far back as I was training, which was about 14 years ago, if my memory serves me right. So this is not something that's new. It's something that's been evolving. And also, there are lots of therapists. I don't know of any personally, but I do know that lots of therapists have second life identities. And for those of you wondering what second life is, it literally is an online community where you create an avatar, a picture of yourself, and then you can live in a virtual world online. It's called Second Life. They've even got their own currency called the Linden dollar. So I know that a colleague, John Wilson from Wilson Counselling Online Events, another online presence in the world of counselling and psychotherapy in the UK, he used Second Life a lot. So, Ken, what is the difference between face-to-face and online? What are some of the things that you've learned with your knowledge of online counselling?
Firstly, and I guess the most important one is So we go and we study counselling, and you study in your modality. What you cannot then do is take that and apply it to online. And it was my idea, the thinking as I went to do the online training, hey ho, you know what, I understand what counselling is all about, and all we're going to basically be doing now is maybe doing this over Skype or a video conferencing call. And I was really surprised at the depth of knowledge that I took away from doing the further training. And I chose, after going through my training, to not practice online for a number of different reasons. And I think one of the reasons that you need to take into consideration when considering online counselling is where you are going to do that counselling. And when I say where, I mean geographical location of where you are and where your client is. Because there are different countries. As soon as you're online, you're no longer geographically linked. So you're in practice as a counsellor, you're probably going to be serving your local community, because it's unlikely that somebody's going to drive for an hour and a half to 2 hours to come and see you. They will engage with counsellors in their locality, as it were. But online, that barrier immediately falls away. So you could be speaking to somebody at the other end of the country, which is fine because they're in the same country as you, so you're covered by the same ethical framework and the same laws. But it starts getting tricky when you start looking at other countries. So there are countries where you may not practice as a counsellor or a psychotherapist unless you're licensed to practice within that country. And if you are now providing online counselling to somebody in that country, there's considerations that you may be breaking the law of that country, or at least the ethical framework within that country. So that needs to be taken into consideration. What happens if that client has a complaint that they wish to raise? Who do they go to? So there's a lot in there, just from, I guess, a logistics, a legality, and an ethical perspective. And that's before we start looking at things like psychological contact. So if you look at person-centered counselling, psychological contact is necessary. It is one of the. It is necessary. The 6 conditions that were viewed by Rogers as being necessary and sufficient. Necessary means it has to be there. How does the distance affect that psychological contact when the person is not there in front of you? Can you have psychological contact? Can you read their facial expressions if you are maybe doing it via text messages or within a online messaging service? There's so much to take into consideration. One of the real interesting areas for me was disinhibition. What am I saying here? Disinhibition, is it? I'm trying to think of the word here. We've got inhibition, where we hold things in. Is it disinhibition?
Disinhibition, you're right, Ken. Yeah.
There you go, lovely. The word just didn't seem to fit in my normal, regular vocab there, Rory, where somebody may be more likely to drop something online because it doesn't feel as real, and it can be really heavy material, kind of a drop and run. And how do you handle that as a therapist? So big message, don't touch it without training in it.
Absolutely, Ken. And some really valid points, the ethical points regarding, where there's the ethical balance if you're in one country and another. And I know in America, in California, you can practice within California, which of course is a huge state, far bigger than the UK, but you cannot practice out of a lot of American states where online counselling has been developed. You can only practice within the state boundary. You cannot practice into the next state. So that's interesting. And also, as you say, it can have a lot of difficulties. So maybe if you're thinking of going down that road, it might be worth looking at one of the many providers who provide counselling training online. What do you say, Cam?
Definitely, it is an interesting area, and it's interesting because it is a mode of communication that is used all the time. I look to my daughter, and she lives on electronic media and the new mediums of communication. And counselling is, I guess, about communicating. It's about somebody being heard, but it's about us being really mindful that it is very different to face-to-face counselling in every aspect of what it is. And one of the considerations to take in to consider is the technology that you use, because the technology is fallible. And you're listening to this podcast, and if you've listened to podcasts before, you'll hear that our sound is usually pretty clear and unbroken. But today, it's a little bit choppy. And it's a little bit choppy because Rory and I are meeting over Skype, and there's been heavy rains in the UK and a bit of a winter storm. And things are not as they normally are. Normally, I can see Rory and he can see me, but we're turning off our cameras so that we can get a little bit better sound out of it. But just that technical consideration is something else to bring in. Can you imagine meeting with a client, creating relational depth, that client bringing in and sharing something that they've never shared with another human being in their life before, and at that moment, your line and your connection with that client breaks? Where does it leave them feeling? How is it? It's called the hole. They can vanish into a hole. How do you contact them? How do you say it's okay? How do you check that they are okay? So much to consider. So it's not just as simple as saying, wow, I know how to counsel. I can do that over Skype. And interestingly enough, Skype, I think you can back me up on this, Rory, is not secure, private and confidential.
It's not, Ken. It's a very little known fact that Skype actually hold every single conversation on their servers. They were taken over, Skype was taken over by Microsoft a few years ago, and it kind of got into the public domain that every single conversation is stored on Skype. So it's totally not useful for online counselling or supervision or anything where you want to have a high degree of certainty that what you're talking about cannot be accessed by a third party. So, you know, that's something that doesn't really come into the public domain. And it's interesting. I do some online supervision. I use our very highly encrypted webinar software to do that. I wouldn't even consider using Skype for that, because it is just it's not secure. So there we go. And finally, I'll just give you a very personal, immediate reaction. As Ken was talking, we're having connection problems here in the UK because of the bad weather. And Ken switched his webcam off, and I've switched my webcam off. And it feels such a different interaction, Ken. I don't know if that's a feeling that's present with you, but I can't see you.
It does, and that's the considerations of working online. We have fallible new technologies, relatively new technologies. They are not secure. It is not a private and confidential. Even email exchange within counselling. So where a client may send you an email and then you will respond to that. They are not private. Even if you're using a private email server, you don't have to look far. You just need to look to the recent elections and the hacked email account. The security is completely different. There's a whole pile of different considerations. Having said that, and I think this is really important to bring balance into this, it was my choice not to go into online therapy right now because it didn't suit me. However, there are many people who do offer online counselling, online therapy, online training, and there are many clients who are benefiting from that. So yes, it does do great good, but you do need training and you do need to consider it carefully.
Absolutely, Ken. And one final point, there's been a great history and tradition of therapists using electronic recording devices in therapy. Roger started it in the 1950s. He spent an absolute fortune on what we would consider a very poor quality tape recorders, reel-to-reel tape recorders. And it's ended up now, I was talking to someone who was speaking about using virtual reality headsets for counselling, and it's already being trialled. I believe that Dr. Kate Anthony is already using virtual reality and virtual reality applications, so people can put on a headset and a set of earphones, and they can be literally in a virtual counselling room. So the technology, I think, will dictate where it goes, Ken.
Indeed, it's exciting and it's interesting, and I think it prompts debate, and take that debate to our Facebook group. You can find that easily by just going onto Facebook and putting in Counselling Tutor. We're right there at the top. If you are a member, then you will know that we have over 3,000 fellow members. It's getting on nearly 4,000 members all over the world. If you're not a member, just knock on the door and we will let you in. And I will share with you that Dr. Kate Anthony also pops into the group from time to time. So it's a good place to hang out and get that conversation going if you have any questions. So moving away from that super high highway and heading down that highway into the Nevada desert to Area 51. This is not the X-Files, this is the C-Files, the counselling files. And we're going to be looking at a rather interesting topic. It is cognitive dissonance, something I know very little about. And Rory, you're going to kind of give us a bit of a taster and an overview of this.
I am. It's a theory that really is a psychological theory, and it's not often taught in counselling. But actually, it's a very useful theory to understand. So just to give you an idea, when we do the Counselling Tutor podcast, we're very choosy, I think is the word, about the kind of psychological theories that we talk about, because some of them just aren't suitable for the world of counselling and psychotherapy. But this one is a borderline case of a piece of research that was done that proves, without any doubt, it's been reproduced many times since, that sometimes we can convince ourselves that literally wrong is right. That's all I'm going to say on that, and I'll explain how that happened and the truly incredible circumstance researchers went to actually find the theory. It's just a fascinating and literally unbelievable story. It's kind of, if I can coin the phrase, it's out of this world.
Out of this world theory with Rory.
Counselling Theory with Rory Lees Oakes.
They say that fact is sometimes stranger than fiction. In the case of groundbreaking research carried out by American psychologist Leo Festinger and his colleagues in 1950s America, this has proved not only true, but legendary. Festinger was born on the 8th of May 1919, and in 1939 he graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree from the City College of New York. After completing his studies at City College, he attended the University of Iowa, where he received his PhD in 1942. One of the reasons Festinger chose Iowa to study was that Kurt Lewin, a now famous psychologist, was one of its faculty staff, and although Festinger's main interest wasn't social psychology, he became interested in Lewin's work, which proposed that human behaviour was the product of the individual and the environment they inhabited, which brings us to one of the most interesting, if bizarre, pieces of psychological research ever carried out. In 1954, Festinger and two colleagues posed as cult members and infiltrated a cult led by a woman named Dorothy Martin, who was based in Oak Park, Illinois. Yes, that's Carl Rogers' neighbourhood. She believed that she was a psychic in contact with alien beings from the planet Clarion, and through automatic writing, that is where someone goes into a trance before channeling a spirit, or in our case alien's message, onto a piece of paper. Martin had formed a fringe religious group called the Seekers, who believed, like her, that aliens were monitoring the Earth and communicating with her. On one occasion, she received a message from the aliens stating that the west coast of America was going to be destroyed by a flood. The date of this event would be the 21st of December 1954. The good news was that aliens would arrive to rescue the Seekers and herself in a flying saucer before disaster struck, a bit like a celestial Noah's Ark. It's important to point out that her followers came from all walks of life, some leaving well-paid jobs, some selling their businesses, and one of her followers was a university professor who was asked to leave his position because he was frightening his students with his end-of-the-world prophecies. It was this group that Festinger and colleagues infiltrated to observe and to test out his hypothesis, which became known as cognitive dissonance. So what was Festinger trying to prove? Well, he believed that people cognitively invest in relationships. As a result, if an opposing view, or in some cases the truth is presented, people will feel an emotional discomfort in seeing a different opinion. Want an example? Well, try telling a Manchester United football fan they would be better off supporting Manchester City because they're a more successful team in the Football League. What do you think their reaction would be? Cognitive dissonance is the uncomfortable process of realising that the investment you put into something or someone is not reaping any reward. Rather than see the truth, one creates elaborate excuses to justify believing in the original idea. And so it came to pass. On December the 20th, 1954, the group known as the Searchers arrived at Dorothy Martin's Oak Park home to await the arrival of the spaceman, who, exactly at midnight, would lead them to his spaceship and save them from the forthcoming apocalypse. The following extract is an observation made by Festinger and his researchers at the time, and it's taken from his notes. He writes, December the 20th, the group expects a visitor from outer space to call upon them at midnight and to escort them to a waiting spacecraft. As instructed, the group goes to great lengths to remove all metallic items from their person. As midnight approaches, zippers, bra straps and other objects are discarded. The group awaits. 12:05 a.m, December the 21st. No visitor. Someone in the group notices that another clock in the room shows 11:55. The group agrees that it's not yet midnight. 12:10 a.m. The clock strikes midnight. Still no visitor. The group sits in stunned silence. The cataclysm itself is no more than 7 hours away. 4 a.m. The group has been sitting in stunned silence. A few attempts at finding explanations have failed. Keach begins to cry. 4:45 a.m. Another message by automatic writing is sent to Keach. It states, in effect, that the god of Earth has decided to spare the planet from destruction. The catalysm has now been called off. The little group, sitting all night long, has spread so much light that God has saved them from the world of destruction. Now, while some people in the group left, others genuinely believe that their devotion had saved the world. In other words, they refused to accept the uncomfortable truth that they'd been hoaxed. Instead, they reinforced the belief by buying into another improbable story. And in fact, what happened is a lot of them went and phoned radio stations the next day saying that they'd in fact saved the world. So how does this research link to our work with clients? What does it tell us about the human condition? Well, abusive relationships produce a great amount of unhealthy investment in both parties. In many cases, we tend to remain and support the abusive relationship due to our investment in them. So that can be something that really happens with clients, that they invest so much, it could be children, it could be monetary investment, that people stay in them. In many cases, and certainly in therapy, clients will use phrases like, he never hits me with his fists, only his open hand, or he only abuses me when he's drunk. Or, she really loves me, it's just in public she humiliates me in front of her friends. In many cases, it's not simply our feelings for an individual that keeps us in an unhealthy relationship, it's often the amount of investment. As therapists, we need to understand that abusive relationships are complex and to understand the investments that clients may have that can blind them from the truth. I suspect that, like some clients, Marion Keach's followers knew the truth. Deep down they understood what was going on, but the investment in the relationship and the feelings of connectedness with the rest of the group stopped them from moving on. It is in therapy that clients are sometimes gently challenged on their beliefs. A non-confrontational, non-judgmental approach by the counsellor provides the emotional soil to check their reality and make the difficult decisions to reinvest in a better life. And that can be a close encounter of the best kind.
Thank you very much, Rory. Truly interesting, that one. Really a topic of to debate, I think. And for me, it's about phenomenology. I trip over that word every now and again. It's how we see the world and how our world is. The world is not as it is as we are. So we see the world as we are. And it's really an example of that such a skewed idea can be sold in the first place, proven wrong, and then resold to the same people. It's just really interesting, and I wonder how many false beliefs we hold as people.
It's interesting, and I'll make no deeper comment to say that this year we've had two kind of monumental political shifts, haven't we? In the UK, we've had the Brexit,
yep.
And in America, we've had the general elections. And without wanting to be partisan, I would be interested, maybe if we came back in 5 years' time, if we're still around, Ken, doing the Counselling Tutor Podcast, to see exactly if those people who believed either way, if their opinions had changed and and how that materializes. Cognitive dissonance is a real effect of the human condition, and like you say, it's we are in a phenomenological state. We believe our own truths. So interesting, and just a super interesting story to tell, Kerr. I really enjoyed telling that story.
So moving now on from cognitive dissonance to appropriate referrals, and I guess something a little more concrete that we are more likely to see within our own counselling practices. And it may be that you have not yet gone into your placement, but it is still something you will be studying and something you will need to write about in your assignments. If you are in placement, you may come across a client that you need to refer, that you may find has either inappropriately been referred to you, or you find that it was an appropriate referral, but maybe the client didn't give all of the information, and that unravels as you're working with them. And it's about making referrals. But here's one thing I can promise you: if you go into being a full-time counsellor psychotherapist, it is likely, very likely, highly probable that you will be making referrals with clients that kind of come in front of you. And this is an area that I know, Rory, you've looked at in some depth. You've taught it for many years, and you've got some interesting ideas on it.
I have. And the first idea that we taught when I used to teach counselling, certainly at practice level, we would have a lesson on working with referrals. And, if you're listening to this and you're a student, and what usually happens, or what should happen with students, is that a more experienced therapist takes the referrals, listens to the client's initial story, and then says, yes, I think that student A is suitable to work with that client, because the material that the client is bringing is a low-level material, suitable. It might be important to the client, but it's suitable for someone who's got very little experience in counselling. And what can happen is that in the referral, a client will speak about what's going on in the referral, and to the person who's making the notes and referring on. And then when you get into the therapy room, they can have a completely different story. And there's a very good reason for that. It may be that in therapy, they feel so secure, they can actually talk about what's going on in their worried mind. And, in my experience, I can remember having, and I've been counselling a long time now, someone referred to me just as, general problems. And I sat down with this person, started talking, and it became very clear very quickly that this person was suffering from psychosis. Yeah, voice hearing, waking nightmares, and quite clearly this person needed another kind of support. And the key thing is here, Ken, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, is that when we need to refer, it needs to be done seamlessly. We don't want the client ever to think that their problems are so difficult that even the counsellor can't help them.
Oh, that's so massive what you've said there, Rory. So, and it can be quite a jolt as a counsellor when you're sitting with a client and that client does get to the point where they would trust to say something. And I'm just going to go on to the example you used, Rory, that they may be hearing voices that they question whether they are there or not. It can be quite a jolt to you as the counsellor, where you kind of the heels dig in and you go, I can't work with this. Right, this falls right out of my competence range. I need to refer this client on. We need to be so mindful of how we cradle that client. Yes, it may be that we need to make that referral, but how do we communicate that with the client? How do we make the journey seamless, and how do we not kind of give that same jolt to that client and say, oh, there must be something wrong with you then, or at least send that message to that client? Because thinking about it, maybe at the assessment, as you said there, Rory, speaking about voices that they may hear, that they may question whether they're there or not, is not something you're going to tell to someone who you don't trust. And in a counselling relationship, that's where we build the trust. Now, it doesn't always have to be voices. It can be any area that you feel falls outside of your skill set, of your competency to be able to do your best for that client. So have you got any kind of ideas of how we can kind of smooth that journey, Rory?
Yeah, I think before you go into practice, and I'd say this to any student or any practicing therapist, what you need is a little black book. It doesn't have to be a black book, but you need a clear idea of who the practice manager is in your practice, who you can talk to should you have a client who becomes either unwell or is clearly someone who you can't work with, yeah. You need to know what referral pathways are, yeah. And you need to be able to be confident enough to say to the client, okay, I'm hearing what you're saying. I think that maybe a different form of support. And here's the key thing. You never, ever say to a client, what you're presenting with is too difficult. You always say, my skill set really doesn't match what you're presenting with. In other words, you're saying, I'm not equipped to deal with you, as opposed to giving the message to the client that their problems are so big that the counsellor can't help. So it's about doing the groundwork before you go into practice. Speak with your referrer. Ask that question. If I get a client who's hearing voices, or a client who comes in, as has happened to me, who wants legal advice, filling in a benefit form, the list is endless of people who've come in. I mean, some of it is quite amusing because they clearly understood that they've been referred to the wrong person. But, I've had people who've got out benefit forms when I worked for a charity. I've sat down, done the contract, and they've got out a housing benefit form and said, can you fill this in for me? So you need to know who the go-to person is.
Yeah.
You need to go to find who the go-to person is. And as I used to say to my students, and if they're listening, they'll be groaning, we hope for the best and we plan for the worst. Yeah. That's what we do. So we have a clear path. We have a clear path that we take when something happens. We don't wait until the last minute and then find out.
100%. I worked in an agency for some time, for some years, and we would refer on a regular basis, and the different agencies that we would refer into had different referral pathways. Some of them it would just be a phone call, and they would the client would then present for an appointment. Others you would need to fill in a form and submit that form, and it's about being aware of that and kind of, as you say, creating that black book or that list of contacts that you can refer into. And then when you're working with that client, also be mindful, how long have you been seeing that client for? And your reaction or the action and how you might deal with that client would be based on that. So if it's the first session where you're seeing a client and they bring something where you see an area for referral, it might be easier for you to refer that client on. But if you've been working for somebody with a client for some weeks, maybe even some months, and then something comes up, what you don't want to be doing is pulling the rug from under their feet. An example of that is a client working with you. You've created great relational depth. They've trusted you to a point where they're now willing to share something they've never shared with anybody before, and it's an area that you cannot work on. And I think, Rory, you've got a great saying that the client can only go as far as you, the counsellor, are willing to go, and if we can't go there, the client can't go there either, because it's for us to go there with them. So in that case, it may be a case of hand-holding that client and supporting them while they wait for that next appointment, because appointments can sometimes take some time to refer into an agency that may have a waiting list. And I think just leaving the client high and dry is maybe difficult for that client. But of course, you would not be able to work on that area, and in some cases, not be able to counsel that client. And I've certainly handheld clients where we've recontracted and our relationship was no longer a counselling relationship. It was just there to kind of smooth the transition into the next service so that the client didn't feel abandoned and didn't feel that the rug has been pulled from their feet.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point. And the other thing is, Ken, is that sometimes you work with clients for quite a period of time and all of a sudden they become unwell. So a couple of things there is, most therapists, there are therapists who are psychiatrists, but generally speaking, most therapists aren't psychiatrists. So, if someone's becoming quite mentally unwell, there could be a lot of reasons for that. It could be anything from lack of sleep to diabetes. So, getting them into the right care, it might be they get into the right care and a week later they come back and they're fine. But it's about making sure that you don't push your decision to work with them to the point where you get into a real difficulty. And there's one way of making sure that you don't, and that is using your supervisor. Speak with your supervisor, taking advice from your supervisor and saying, look, this is where I'm at. This is what my client's presenting. And, if you need to phone your supervisor in between sessions, phone them up. You should have that kind of relationship. I know I can phone my supervisor up during business hours and get a view on things. So it's about using supervision as well. Don't try and go it on your own, because I've seen that happen and the results aren't pretty for the client and by default for the therapist.
I agree. And again, I think what's really important as we come to the end of this topic is, yes, you cover this in your training. You're going to do a whole section and you're going to write assignments on appropriate referrals. But if that's the where you leave it and you don't think of it any further until you're in a situation where you need to refer a client, that can be really discerning for yourself. It can be you can be faced with panic in that moment of, what do I do now? And I think your point, Rory, is really good. You can take that to your supervisor when you don't have a referral to make and say, what happens if I have a referral to make? And maybe your supervisor has a list of people and contacts as well. So definitely something to consider. I think it's about being a considered practitioner, and referrals is an area that you don't only want to consider when it's time to make a referral. You want to be considering it before that point. It's part of being a professional practitioner.
Absolutely. So it's all good advice and pretty essential. And I guarantee that if your career is long enough, you'll have to make plenty of them.
Yeah.
You'll have to make plenty of
referrals. Yeah. What an episode, Rory. We started off on that information superhighway, heading straight into Area 51 of counselling and speaking about cognitive dissonance, and of course appropriate referrals, a really important part of being a reflective and proficient and ethical practitioner. And it brings us to the end of episode 28 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
So as I always say at the end, stay grounded and stay safe. And at the end of this, I'll also say the truth is definitely out there.
Oh, I do like that. And if you want to get more truth and get the links from today's episode, then just head on over to counsellingtutor.com. That's counselling with 2 L's. It's the UK spelling. Counsellingtutor.com. Click on the podcast tab. Go to episode 28. All the show notes neatly written out with all the links that we've discussed today. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.